Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Trust and safety teams have a lot to hide. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. My name is Julie Danley and I'll be your moderator. I have some housekeeping items to go over before we start the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and the on-demand will be sent to all registrants in a few days. In your webinar console, you will see various widgets. You can hide, minimize, and resize these boxes as you see fit. I would like to call out a few actions you can take. On the upper right side, you can request a demo of Authenticate's solution. This won't take you away from today's webinar. And below that, you will see the resource list. This is where you can download a copy of today's slides as well as some additional resources you may find helpful. Below that, you'll see the Q&A box. Submit your questions here at any time during the presentation, but we will hold the questions for the end and go over those before closing out the webinar. We have some upcoming webinars that you can register for using the three boxes below your slides. The first is a continuation of this webinar, Trust and Safety Part 2. Use the registration button to join us on May 20th for a continuation. The second webinar is next week, April 29th, Part 1 of our Intro to the Dark Web series, What's Hiding in the Dark? We will discuss what the dark web is, why investigators should be on the dark web, as well as the risk. Lastly, we've created a page for you to be able to see all of our upcoming webinars through June, and you can use those to register for any or all of those webinars. And lastly, just as a reminder, there is a quick survey to complete at the end. It takes about a minute, and your answers help us improve our webinar, so we really appreciate your feedback. And in fact, our upcoming webinars are all been designed based off that feedback we're getting. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Jeff Phillips and Adam Hinkie. Jeff Phillips is the Director of Product Marketing for Authenticate, where he focuses on customer needs and driving product go-to-market strategy. Jeff has 20-plus years of product marketing experience, including 7 years at Microsoft. Adam is the open source intelligence trainer here at Authenticate. He is a cyber threat intelligence and intelligence analyst with more than 3 years in cyber threat intelligence at Huntington National Bank and 9 years as an intelligence analyst in the United States Marine Corps from the battalion level all the way to HQ U.S. Special Operations Command. For those of you just joining us, welcome to today's webinar. Trust and safety teams have a lot to hide. Thank you for taking your time out and being here, and let's get started. Over to you, Jeff and Adam.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Phillips. Thank you for joining us today. Adam and I are really excited about the session, being able to share some best practices for those of you conducting sensitive online research related to trust and safety initiatives. So before I go through the agenda, I'd like to set a little bit of context for the agenda. Everyone knows to a certain level that what we do online is being tracked, right? So targeted advertising appearing in your search results, in your online social media feeds, is probably the most familiar example. So we know that more than ever, online activity is being tracked, it's being monitored, it's even being brokered between sites. But what does this mean for you from the sensitive online research activities you're doing, and can it negatively impact your investigations? And so the short answer is yes. These mechanisms can expose an investigator's intent, even your identity, which means it can spoil an investigation. There could be negative ramifications to a company's brand, or worst case, there could be retaliation by whoever you're targeting, right, back against the company or against an individual analyst. So what we want to do today is I'm going to start off the session by walking through a number of typical trust and safety research use cases and the specific investigation needs we've heard from discussions with our customers and with prospects. Then Adam's going to jump in and take the mic, and he's going to talk to you about the what and the where when it comes to online investigation risks, and then specifically go into what are some of the best practices you can leverage to protect yourself as well as protect the company. At the end, we will be sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Feel free to submit those, by the way, questions as they come to you. Submit them. Adam and I can see them. We'll either address them in real time or we'll get to them at the end of the session. But we'll try to make this as interactive as we can. All right, let's jump in. So, we've been talking with a lot of trust and safety teams over the past year or so, and in many organizations, if I had to define it, I would say that these organizations exist to protect online communities and digital platforms from harmful content, from harmful conduct. Most of the companies have systems, they have tools, there's community self-policing, things that raise flags of potential unsafe activity, but what we end up talking to these companies about is that it's often necessary to have humans conduct actual sensitive online research or investigations into users, into specific groups or situations where they need to get the whole picture of what's going on in the online community so they can take appropriate action. So I would say we see this type of research really fall into one of three general buckets. Right, there's protecting the integrity of the service or the community itself in order to create and maintain trust, right? We've got to have trust for people to continue to use our services and to be comfortable engaging on them. So that's one category. Acceptable use, for example, falls into that. We have the other side, or another element, which is about protecting the users that are using our online services. Maybe that's protecting them from fraud. Maybe that's protecting them from malicious activity like being exposed to phishing activities, but it's protecting the users. And then the third bucket is about protecting the actual online platform itself, right? So protecting the platform from cybersecurity threats. In general, trying to protect the brand around our offering and how it operates. So what I want to do now is, again, we see this as trust and safety teams have a lot of different, or can be involved in a lot of different things. And a trust and safety team has teams within it that have specific activities that they undertake. So I'm going to focus on some of the customers we have that are dealing with acceptable use enforcement, marketplace surveillance, so dealing with counterfeit and stolen goods, and then research and investigations that are related to fraud. So fraud related to compromised accounts or inauthentic or fake accounts. All right, so acceptable use enforcement, and I'm highlighting the enforcement operations element here. So we see it a lot of tech companies, for example, social media platforms, they could be fintech services companies, where they need to conduct research of parties on their platform that have been flagged, as we talked about earlier. So due to some posts or some types of interaction that they're having on the platform. And that often includes continuing the investigation beyond their platform itself, out onto the broader web, right? So they need to get that full picture. They need to go beyond the platform, and that opens them as researchers and as a company even to more exposure. So let me highlight two different elements to this. So on the social media side, we tend to see a lot of activity around content abuse moderation. So not just moderation, but really dealing with content abuse, right? And we're talking about areas around hate and terrorism, drug and human trafficking, fake news. So, you're dealing with, just not just someone saying something bad, but significant. So you're doing research on potential users or groups that are potentially very malicious. And they're not just involved or concerned with the content itself. That's one aspect of content moderation, but there's underlying drivers to why this content may be being posted, whether it's to recruit people, whether it's to just overall have a negative influence on a given community, or maybe they're trying to raise money and for terrorism financing. So the need here is to be able to go out and to make the right decisions, whether it's to block or to remove, potentially to report to authorities. They need to go out to different websites, to social media. They're looking at potential Telegram channels related to a user or a specific group. And so they need the whole story, as I mentioned. And in this particular use case, the ability to cloak their appearance or remain and be anonymous, either on their own platform or across the general web, across the overall web, is a significant need. They also have some certain challenges because of the places they have to go and the sites they need to visit or forums they need to get to. Their own IT staff, the security group, may block their access to certain sites, right, from how URLs are categorized. Or it might be a geographic issue. I can't get in a certain region, and I have to be within Europe or be within South America from an internet perspective to be able to access that information. We also see acceptable use happen on the fintech side. So here we're talking about illegal or brand negative activity. So where they're concerned with merchants that are in a business that the company doesn't want to be associated with, right? Child exploitation or illegal pharmaceutical sales. Or it could even, as this is fintech, we've seen some where it's access to financial information that shouldn't be being shared with people, like early quarterly results. Again, while they're doing a lot of investigation and research to make decisions about what's going on their site, they're often have to deal with law enforcement and regulators when it comes to things like terrorist financing and weapon sales. And so how they collect the data, how they maintain chain of custody in terms of evidence they may be able to collect is super important. So tools around collection and collaboration and being able to audit what's happened is very critical. They also have the challenge of wanting that whole story. And we've had some customers where, again, due to IT reasons, blocking sites or the merchants themselves being nefarious and taking action to impede their investigations, or the browser is saying this isn't a secure place to be, they're not able to get the full picture. And so being able to get the full picture to make the right decision, to make a complete analysis and recommendation is critical to these acceptable use enforcement types of activities. All right, so I said the other bucket was around marketplace surveillance, right? So these are customers where they need to be vigilant about the offerings put forth by sellers on their marketplace, right? They're investigating, removing, again, potentially having to report around counterfeit, stolen goods, be they fake goods, be they physical or digital goods. On the online marketplace side, we've seen companies where that marketplace is the core business. And the primary driver of the community. We've even seen the establishment within trust and safety, but sub-teams like e-crime teams or counterfeit crimes units that spend their days investigating individuals and often organized groups that may be selling these types of goods on their site, which means then often there's, besides removing, taking down, there's reporting to law enforcement. They're, again, particularly concerned with remaining anonymous and cloaking who they are, primarily so that they don't tip off targets in this case, right? So that person can disappear and you no longer can find them. They even need to go beyond, because they often have to engage, they even potentially have to go beyond being anonymous, what we would sometimes call non-attribution, to where they need to do what we would call misattribution. So they need to look and appear as if they're someone else or coming from a different type of machine. Like a basic example with a digital fingerprint would be maybe to engage with this particular site, they actually need to, even though they're on a Windows computer, they need to look like a mobile device. As compared to, if we talk about digital services, there's a lot of similarity here, but what I'm talking about are communities and services where there's complaints from the community itself and tips about fraud and illegal activity related to digital goods and services. So somewhat similar to physical goods, but buyers may be renting something or crowdsourcing resources. And again, the teams are concerned with remaining anonymous on behalf of the company as well as themselves. But they're also very interested in having an audit trail of their analysts. So we've seen this come up. What did my analysts do? Where did they go? Have we an ability to deal with compliance issues and have an audit trail? And we've also noticed, for some reason, compared to even on the physical goods side, that they're often dealing with toxic content on their platforms where spam is being spread and adware and phishing links to malware. So that ability to be isolated and protected from this toxic content, not infect the corporate network, is critical to the use case for these teams that are doing this type of surveillance of their overall marketplace. All right, the last bucket we want to talk about, and again, the concept here being this is significant research and investigations, and you've got to be able to protect yourself, and or you open yourself and the company up to a lot of potential risk. And this is another one where we see a lot of companies dealing with compromised accounts or fake accounts, so things like account takeover. And I segmented this a little differently, because compromised accounts and inauthentic accounts we've seen this be an issue no matter who the trust and safety team is, right? And there are systems and tools that maybe raise a flag about a fishy transaction, but again, the action sometimes isn't so simple as to shut it down or turn it off, and that a human has to engage. So, an example, we have a customer that has teams that are dedicated to fraudulent activities by product related to a number of digital services they offer. And so one team, for example, is focused on sort of large-scale fraud activities that take place related to gift cards. And so now it's not about just one individual committing fraud. It's an entire organization that's out there. And these teams often deal with things like the fact that they get threat intel feeds that maybe tell them about certain breaches, usernames and passwords, credit cards have been released on the public web, or people can buy compromised accounts on the dark web. And so they're needing to go out, and while these feeds provide you some information, they don't give you all of the information. So the ability to have the capability to go and specifically access and engage and download some of these breach packages are critical. So again, being anonymous, being isolated are all critical. And then on the inauthentic accounts or fake accounts, here we're talking about some of the trust and safety teams really dealing with puppet accounts, influence, basically the spread of misinformation. And what I wanted to highlight here is that we've got certain customers where they have teams that are focused, because these entities really establish legitimacy by building up a fake persona, and that's from fake followers to ratings and reviews, likes. These things are sold in marketplaces to criminal elements or anyone that wants to boost their appearance. And so we know of teams that go and specifically target these underground markets that sell these kinds of digital assets to help protect their fraud going on their platform. So that's in addition to undertaking the research of the specific account and fake news or whatever they may be spreading, where they're having to go deeper across the chain to get to some of the source of these things. So here again, being able to isolate it from toxic content where they're going, make sure I'm anonymous and can blend in is very critical to these trust and safety teams. So these are the types of research we're seeing. And so what I'm going to do now is I want to hand it over to Adam as he talks about, look, this is significant and serious stuff. You've got to have good tradecraft is a term. What are some things you should do, be looking for, and that you should do to make sure you're able to execute properly? Turn it over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the background on the majority of the use cases that we're seeing out there in the trust and safety realm. The first thing we're going to get started with actually is a poll question that I'm going to push to everyone right now. And we're basically just looking for feedback on what your biggest worry or challenge is. This is going to help us gauge some things and look at that.
Right. As we go forward, I'm curious how much of it is it, there's performance metrics and caseload to, risky sites and anonymity, as I talked about. But I didn't talk about some of those more business drivers like performance metrics and backlogs. It would be interesting. We can see that you guys are answering the question. What's your guess, Adam? Which one do you think is going to come up as the biggest worry?
It's tough to say. Risky content, risky websites, or maybe even the backlog volume, looking for something to help ease that stress, depending on number of members on the team. It's, really hard to guess.
I think we got about half. What are the results looking like?
Let's move over to the results, and I'll start pushing this to the audience as well. And that's kind of what I thought for the most part. Accessing risky websites and contents without putting harm to corporate IT systems. And that makes sense to what I've seen in my past and my history with doing cyber. Everybody's afraid of introducing malware into the company and then getting in trouble for it, right?
Makes a lot of sense. No, I agree.
Okay, so think we're good here. We'll move on and we'll see what we can always go back to it if we need to. But so, as those poll results, those results have shown, investigators are worried about accessing websites that they shouldn't be or that could cause problems. But as investigators, what do we need to focus on? We need to obtain this information accurately. We've got to protect not only our investigations, but ourselves in our organization when we're investigating and doing these investigations and separating our personal work and investigations when we're doing them. And so then you run into these challenges, right? So you may have content that's blocked for specific reasons, right? Your network security team's probably blocked a bunch of websites because they know they're bad. They have a list of bad websites that are blocked on a constant basis. Another main challenge is documentation or your chain of custody, right? If you're going to submit this to law enforcement or submit your investigation to law enforcement or maybe another team inside the organization to remove a user, you got to have that documentation ready and done correctly. A big one is obtaining that information without alerting your suspect. Well, it's always been going to be a challenge. And how do you go to so when I was at Huntington, I would go to a phishing site. How do I go and make sure that actor who created that phishing site doesn't know that I'm looking at it, right? Because if I'm looking at it, there could be an issue. He could then move it or do something else, which I'll cover here in a second. There's untrusted or unwanted content, right? Again, you're going to a website that you don't know anything about. You don't know what's on there. You don't know what the content may be. And if you get into the dark web or deep web searching for research, there may be some unwanted content you don't want to view, and it's out there. So, just be aware of that. Lastly is risk of retaliation. And this goes back to the third bullet of obtaining information without alerting your suspect. If the bad guy knows you're looking at him, he could then retaliate against you, whether it's a DDoS or an information campaign against your organization, or maybe it's going to harm your reputation if for some reason the person doing the research wasn't as savvy as they should have been. And so you've got to be aware of this and see some of these challenges you're going to face as you go forward, right? And so as we talk about this, well, how do we minimize risk, right? The big thing comes down to is minimizing the risk we take when we do these investigations. But how do you do that, right? Well, you got to protect, in order to do that, you got to protect your systems against any and all threats and easily access the content without, linking the research to, again, yourself or your employer. Because when you're doing this research, you're not just your employer who may be at risk. If you are not doing the right things, you could be at risk. So these are, some things to look at. And now, so again, we go back to easily accessing the content without it being linked. Well, how do you accomplish that? You have to have an understanding of how your research and online activity is tracked, improve the tradecraft used while doing that research, but in doing so, you need to do that in a secure and easy-to-use manner. And so this leads us to our next poll question, which I'm going to push to you right now. And it is basically, what do you use for your investigation-related researches? Are you using the same computer? Do you have a managed attribution system? Do you have a completely separate networking computer? All things that people can do.
This one's always interesting. And then as you go into, I know we'll talk about later about, while I may think I'm protected, be it anonymous or protected from viruses, et cetera, what really can still be found out about me if I'm using a VPN. Well, is that good enough? So I always find this one interesting.
There's also the risk of malware and other things that could be downloaded onto your machine that, if you're not up to date on the most recent antivirus, you may not get it, or the potential for a zero-day attack. So these are all things you need to look at too. Let's say we're about half there, correct, Jeff? Roughly?
Yeah. Let's take a look, see what's popping up here.
All right, so we'll push our results to the audience, and this is kind of what I expected was you guys using the same computer and same web browser for your day-to-day actions. Some are using Incognito Mode. You got a tie there between Incognito Mode and a VPN, and then a few with a separate, completely whole new network, and some with managed attribution system like Silo. So moving on. So how are you tracked online? Well, your internet address and connection are the main thing someone can track online, right? As a threat analyst at Huntington, if I went to a website, that IP address would come back through Huntington National Bank. Just is what it is. It's registered. My IP goes through all the network security tools that Huntington had. It still came out as an egress of Huntington National Bank. That's just the way it goes. Your attributes of your browser and your device. Some things you might want to think about here is, stuff that's passed by your browser, what device you're using, the operating system, even software and plugins you may have installed. Time zone's a big one, and now even audio, video devices, or any devices that may be connected to your machine to your computer could be shared from your browser. Then you have stuff that's stored in your browser, right? Cookies and HTML5 local storage. We all know cookies. For those who don't know, cookies are used to just help you reload a site without having to download the entire content. So it's an easy way to get that site back up and running without having to download everything. But that's stored in your browser. And some of these have tracking mechanisms in there to show that you're going to the sites. And then you have stuff that's derived from the content displayed when you're looking at these websites, whether it's HTML5, canvas fingerprinting, or even audio being played. Again, all this stuff is out there. And then your behavior is what you got to look at as well. If you're one of these people who it has a routine every morning where you go to work, you get on your computer, you log into your Gmail or your Yahoo Mail, and then you go to Fox News, and then you look at your banking information, and then you go to look at the sports to see it's a Monday morning. Hey, what was the football scores last night, or hockey scores from 2 nights ago, or whatever. All that's being tracked. So if you're looking for certain things and you're on Google typing in the hockey scores from last night, that stuff's being collected when you're using it. Any social media connections or any other interests that you have, it's all being tracked and cataloged somewhere. Somebody has that information. So what does this really mean? It means your browser is really not your friend. It betrays you, and it's something you need to keep an eye on and be aware of, right? There's all these built-in tracking mechanisms and the advertisements and everything that you'll see. We'll go into that a little more here in a few slides. But here's something you can do, right? This is just a test to see how unique you actually are. So this is a website called amiunique.org. It just lets you see how identifiable you are on the internet based upon your browser and your computer and everything you're using. If you go and you click on View My Browser Fingerprint, what should come up is a result looking like this, which shows that this device is roughly somewhat unique out of the 3 million fingerprints in its data set. But you got to look further into the data, right? Yeah, only 10% of the users are using Apple, but 40% of the data set that they have is using Chrome. A very small percentage, 0.88%, is using the most recent version, right? And only a small percentage is in the -5 UTC code. So you're okay in the sense of a lot of people are using Chrome and a lot of people are using like the English language set, but you're not matching up with everybody when it comes to the version you're using and where you're using it from. So these are things you need to look at and remember. Excuse me. So with that, what does this mean? You or your device are unique, but that you still have privacy issues and you still can get betrayed. Websites are tracking you even when you don't log in, and we're going to show that here in a second. But when you log in, there's even more data that can be pulled together and more data that is collected. And so, again, if you do log into those services, there's potential for a lot of information to get collected. And the next slide will show that, right? This is going to load up here and showing some screenshots of off Facebook activity that's out there, right? And so as this loads, you're going to notice a couple of things are lining up with regards to aviation interests, Denver News, Washington, D.C., firearms. All this data was collected, and again, it's off Facebook activity. Well, how is it collected? More than likely, the user went and accessed those websites or that material on, say, because this is a web app, this is a cell phone app, on his cell phone from his browser on his cell phone, and went and typed in NRA.com or looked at some firearms or looked at aviation. These are all things you need to kind of be aware of and look at as far as you're doing this on one of your devices, but Facebook may not even be running, but it's still collecting this information that you're using. It's being passed behind the scenes. So you need to just be wary of what you're doing and how you're doing this. And this is why I mentioned at the beginning of separating your personal life, your work life and your investigation side when you're doing on the internet. What I do in my personal time as an analyst is nowhere near what I'm going to do as an investigation, especially when you get into the deep and dark web or, for that matter. So as we move forward, okay, a lot of you might be thinking, yeah, this is me, but don't really feel that bad. We have investigators who this happens to all the time, right? We have, we've done several webinars with law enforcement and other investigators who that's their full-time job is to conduct investigations. And a majority of them use the same computer and web browser for their day-to-day work as they do with their investigations. And so you're crossing those boundaries and causing some, harm, not really harm to yourself, but putting yourself out there with the additional data that you don't want leaked. One line I want to use from this side that is very, very important is conducting online research requires the same care as going undercover in the physical world. If anybody's watched any crime shows or stuff like that where they talk about someone going undercover and how they need to have a story and understand what they're talking about when they're this person and forget everything in their real life, that's kind of what we mean by that, right? If you're going to go and be online, if you're going to do an investigation and say you're looking at someone in the Middle East, you need to come out of the Middle East. You need to have a node to exit you out of the Middle East so you look the same, using the same web browsers and devices that they use over in the Middle East. So you just got to take that same care and that same, approach to researching and doing investigations to protect yourself and your organization.
At the end of the day, right, Adam, I was just, as I hear this and listen to this, and I hear you all the time talk about this, and it's, these things that are collected about you end up, can tip off whatever person or entity that you're researching, right? They can see all of those likes and things from your personal life and make the connection back to you, right, and or your company.
Well, and don't think that these bad actors aren't noticing people who are researching them and doing research against you. They're if they're getting looked at from a certain organization or a certain company and they want to know who's going after them, they'll do the same research. It's not hard. Anybody can do this. It's just, you just got to protect yourself is what it really comes down to. And this moves us on to our next question before we move into the next topic that I'm going to push to everybody, which is, how many of the individuals here on the call access the dark web for investigations and what your familiarity is with it?
And this one's always interesting. I know for a lot of people, the dark web's something they've heard about, but or maybe have never accessed themselves. It was mentioned earlier, I think, by Julie. We'll be doing a dark web webinar in the future here if you want to come and learn more. But it's always interesting to me too about what's happening. As I talked about in some of those use cases earlier, Adam, we do have quite a few trust and safety teams where the research they need to do to get that full picture can take them and lead them to needing to get access to the dark web. I think I mentioned like counterfeits. Well, a lot of that counterfeit operations and those types of products may be getting sold on your marketplace, but it also leads to where that might be happening on the dark web. So there is that potential need there for a number of our trust and safety teams.
Yeah, and we'll get into that here in a few minutes, Jeff. There's a lot of data out there. So let's push the results to everybody. And as I figured, people are familiar with it and they just need to have access to it, right? But they can't. And that's kind of what we saw also with the law enforcement side, or on other sides, other webinars we've had, is that there's a need to access it, but they don't look at it, or they can't. Very interesting results here, Jeff. We'll have to delve into this.
Well, I'm focused on the second one, right? Where, I've heard of it, but I don't have a need to access it. And that can definitely be true. Not everyone needs to access the dark web. I guess from our side, we're always encourage people just to make sure that that's true. I've seen customers be surprised by finding out things related to their service, their offering, their community, that they didn't think was happening on the dark web, that those types of things were. So that number is a little bit high to me that they don't need an access to it. But
Yeah,
I would say at least
agree
make
with
sure
that.
you're
And
aware.
yeah, and yeah, I think that's interesting too. I misread that originally too, and so I apologize. But yeah, not having a need to access it, I think there needs to be some deeper discussions there because there might be some things you're missing. So now we've got your dark web questions. We see that majority of you say you don't really need to access it, but there's a lot of data on the dark web that you may be missing, right? Insights into criminal activity. I've seen stuff where they talk about how to hack for certain platforms, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, and what some exploits are out there for that. There's also data breach warnings and targeting of specific entities, right? If you're able to gain access to these groups, which can take some time, you can have advanced warning. I know of an individual that I used to work with. He has an inroad into the anonymous group, and so when they're going to do something, that he gets a little advance warning that they're putting out this package to send out to other computers to then do an operation. And it took him years to cultivate, right? That wasn't something he did overnight, but it's there, and he's able to see what's going on. There's also the ability to search for stuff related to your brand or intellectual property, products, and assets, right? You may not think that people are doing this, but you could find some counterfeit goods being sold online, especially on the dark web. So just some things to think about to maybe leverage once you're, if you want to access the dark web. So what does this mean, right? What is our risk? So there's always a risk involved to an investigator when you're doing this, right? Whether that be evading or bypassing corporate security. No one wants to make corporate security unhappy. If they're happy, then you're happy. But you're missing out on, sometimes these investigations, if you're doing it improperly, you're missing out on logging and auditing. You're also not being protected by the corporate security stuff that you have in place, their corporate security stack, specifically like intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems. So there's a major risk there as well. You have a risk of attribution, right? If you access a site and it can get attributed to the company or to yourself. So you just got to be careful. But there's also the potential for information slippage of not only the user, but corporate data as well. If you get the third one, which is, if you get hit with some malicious content, which we'll cover in a second. And then I mentioned earlier about reputational harm to the organization, right? So say an actor notices you're poking around, but and he starts going at you and starts noticing that you're not as secure as you think you are, and he gains access to the system, to the endpoint through a malicious inject. That guy could then just spread it out, for reputational harm. Hey, by the way, so-and-so was looking at me and I was able to inject some code into the machine and now I have access to their entire network. Not a good thing to have happen, right? And then the last thing, but again, I've hit on it already, but malicious content, whether it's insertion or downloading of malicious content in the back end, being redirected through a web redirect traffic, and then monitoring traffic, right? People are still, like I said, you are being monitored where you go. Those sites are logging who you are, what your IP address is, user agent string, all that information is being logged for someone to use later, someone to look at later. So we've got all this data out there on the open, deep, dark web that's valuable to investigators. And you need to be able to access that content, but the risk is high. So what do you do? Well, first is the not so great options, right? You have incognito mode or VPN mode, right? Using incognito mode or private browsing, it's better than nothing, but really it's not the right tradecraft use, right? It clears cookies, it clears form data, but it's really used to protect you from someone else using your machine if you're doing a hot swap of computers at an organization, which probably is not happening, but I've seen it in my military experience where I'm logging on a machine one day and then for 12 hours and then somebody else is logging into it the next 12 hours. Your browsing and investigations, they're still associated with your network. You're just hiding stuff from the other person that may access the computer, right? On the flip side is VPN or dirty connection, right? Two different kinds of things, but you kind of want to use them in conjunction. A virtual private network is going to provide you some anonymity, and it's better than using your own network to conduct research. But in all honesty, over time, that's going to get, it's going to happen, right? Where people are going to build a profile on you. There's VPN networks out there, specifically some of the open and free ones, that say that they don't log your traffic, that's, they could share your data. It's not saying that, there's logs out there of everything, but you don't know if they're going to share your data or not, right? On the back end of that, if you go and say you go use Starbucks to do an investigation, it's an open and free Wi-Fi. One, you don't know who's on that with you, who can then maybe inject something into your machine maliciously by accident using that Wi-Fi, which is possible. But two, it's just not really safe. It only partly hides you. And even if you use the VPN in connection with that open free Wi-Fi, you're only hidden for a short amount of time. If you start doing a pattern where, say, you do an investigation from 10 to noon at Starbucks using Starbucks Wi-Fi and a VPN, you go back to work from 12:30 to 2, and then from 2:30 to 4, you're doing the same thing at the same Starbucks. Over time, someone's going to start collecting that data and putting it to you. So it only obfuscates you for a little bit of time. So again, the not so great option, but still better than nothing, really, right? If you have that option. The next one is a little more complex. It's inexpensive and it's complicated, which is building your own network. And if you've got loads of money to do this, by all means, spend the money on getting building your own network. It's going to cost some money. It's going to take some time. You've got to have the right, purchase the right computers and the network infrastructure, purchase an auditing tool in order to audit the stuff. But yeah, you're auditing and monitoring, but that's not getting put into your corporate network. So now you've got to have someone monitoring the audit systems you've put in place to audit and monitor your team, right? You also may have some security and evidentiary compliance requirements along with that, where, say, you've got to do some forensic scans every so often to make sure that the data is not corrupt and things of that nature. Another hard sell is getting these devices managed by corporate IT. Corporate IT guys, a lot of them just follow the steps and rules that they have. So they get a new computer in, open it up, load the company's software package on there, and then hand it out. Well, if you tell them to buy you 10 computers, you need to have a conversation with them on, I want these 10 computers, but I want them set up this one this way, this one this way, and so on, so that you don't have that corporate network software loaded onto your machine. And they may not want to do that, right? It's extra steps, it's extra work for them, and they may not have the knowledge or the capability to do that. So get some things to think about as far as this. Earlier, Jeff mentioned misattribution. This would be a misattribution network, right? You're building it to create personas and certain things on there that you would use to go to do different things. Lastly, the last one, which is now a new or modern term, but related to misattribution, is managed attribution, right? You're able to easily customize how you appear, control your specific attributes, whether it's browser fingerprint, with your browser fingerprint, like your time zone, language, what keyboard set you're using, the web browser you're even using. You're able to control your network address, whether it's coming through a different node or your internet provider or subscriber information. And then at the end, your data transfer and protection. Because you're using a managed system, you're isolating your session from your workstation for work, your endpoint, and so you're protected against malware and some of those threats. Okay, and so this is where, again, this is not necessarily a sales pitch, but this is where our silo comes in from Authenticate. It's a managed attribution as a service. You're able to use the same computer you use day to day and browse via our cloud-based service, right? You can customize it. You can cloak your appearance to external parties. I know the slide's a little small to see, but on there, the user agent string says Firefox Linux. That can be customizable to, say, Windows 10 Chrome or Apple Firefox, or Linux. And you can say whatever you wanted to say for the most part, that we have a list of, those customizable user agent strings. You're able then to select a physical location. So again, I mentioned earlier about you're doing an investigation of someone in the Middle East. Well, you can come out of one of our Middle East egress nodes. And again, you look like you're coming from those Middle Eastern countries from the same time zone and the same language set that they're using there. The last thing that we can talk about is your browsing session is isolated from the workstation. So you have the ability to prevent malware infection. right? You're basically looking at a recording of a browsing session through your machine, through your computer. So if you go to this website and it wants to download malicious code, guess what? It's not on your workstation. It's on that cloud, server that we built. And at the end, it's deleted. It also prevents websites from identifying you based on your workstation. It allows for a complete audit trail using your security, incident, and event management systems. My last organization, we use Splunk. You're able to take the logs from Silo and pump them into your SIM, allowing them to be audited and meet compliance and regulations. That's always a good thing too, right? You don't want audit to come after you if you don't have to, right? Keeping audit happy is also about as good as keeping security happy. So at the end of all this, some things to remember. There's tons of information out there. Take advantage of what is available, right? Again, the poll results indicated that a majority of you know what the dark web is, but don't really want to access it or don't have a need to access it. Have a think about that, and maybe you might want to see if there is some information out there that's available that can help you in your investigations. Beware of your tracking mechanisms and your digital fingerprint. Again, I talked about separating your personal fingerprint, your online fingerprint versus your work online fingerprint versus an investigation online fingerprint. You really don't want to be using the same computer that you use on a day-to-day basis for work and your investigations unless you have a system to do so, like a managed attribution system, and fully understand that impact, how those will impact your investigations. You've got to safely access the websites, social media, and other content, right? Again, personal, work, investigations. Just keep them separate. You've got to move at the speed of fraudsters. You've got to find solutions and find tools out there that are going to make your job easier, right? If you're able to build your own network and like we talked about the complicated and expensive side, that may keep you fast and may make you faster, but you don't really know until you try, right? And then lastly, again, back to the dark web, be aware of it and make a plan to try and access that data that's out there. There's tons of information, and people are talking on every day about bad things and how they're doing and what they're selling, and there's tons of data out there on the dark web. So be aware of it and make a plan to access it. Pending any questions, that is the end of this presentation.
As a reminder, you can, you can submit your questions in our Q&A box, and we'll open that up now and start going over those questions.
Thanks, Julie. All right, I'm taking a look through the questions. We have some of you that have submitted along the way. All right, I'm going to grab one here. Hey, Adam, we could maybe both hit this one. What are some examples of not being able to access information or data that I may want to see? Like what would be some examples of I want to access that, but I'm not able to see it? If you don't mind, I have two quick ones off because I talked about these on my use case. An example, one of them, we've had a lot of customers where for good reasons or appropriate reasons for the majority of the company, but where IT security or firewall policies block you from getting the site. You simply are not allowed to visit those sites due to the category they fall in. And again, while that's appropriate for the company as a whole, the types of research that needs to happen by these trust and safety teams, we need to be able to get around that firewall. And if you are going to go around it, you need to be protected, right? And IT needs to be confident with auditing and protection from malware. So there's simply you're blocked from getting to it. Another one to me, Adam, is there's certain, you may not in a given region. Let's take like news sites in certain very restrictive countries. If you go to that site from a US IP, you'll get presented with very general, typical news, right? But if you were to actually if you could represent yourself as a mobile device within region, you would get presented with a much different site with like a lot of propaganda and things of that nature coming from that site. So it's another example of, you're not getting access to the information you really want. I don't know if you have any others.
No, then those are great. The best examples I can give, right? You're blocked by your corporate's IT policy, and that happened to me a couple of times where I couldn't get access to and I knew it was a legitimate site because I had other tools to look at and research and did it on my own computer, my own personal machine. But sometimes these lists that they come out with to block sites, sometimes a legitimate site gets added because of something that happened. No security and network security system is perfect, right? They're pulling these sites from whatever Intel feeds and stuff that they have, and if it's on there, then you can't do anything about it. And again, the other one I agree with as well. You got to look at it from the perspective of it also helps if you're coming with a different language set, right? If you're coming out of, we'll use the Middle East because it's the easiest one to use, and you're doing Google search in the Middle East, but typing in English, you're going to get drastically different results if you type in Arabic. Mm-hmm. Drastically different results in Google. So that right there is just a key investigative standpoint as well.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to grab another one here. So how do you ensure that analysts or researchers are going to places they should be and not going to places they shouldn't be going?
That's always the tough one, right? And for me, it's about training the analyst to go to do the right thing and ensuring you have the right analyst that you've hired to do the job. But also, it's that audit trail, right? Like I said, again, everything you do on a corporate network should be cataloged and logged in a security incident and event management system like Splunk, and someone's able to look at what you're doing and have alarms and alerts that fire when you go to the wrong sites or warnings that happen, and then someone can ask the question. But if you're doing online investigations and your investigation's not being logged, it's not a good thing, right? Like you can't. Right. It's hard. It's a hard answer to that because there's so many layers to doing that. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and if I tie it back to some of the solutions when people picked what they do today, even if you build your own dedicated network, you're often not going to have IT's not able to spend time putting in an audit trail or enforcing policies there, or on a VPN, you're not able to enforce certain policies that you want to. So, one of the benefits to the managed services, that ability to enforce policy. Things like, let me give an example, right? Well, maybe I want people to be able to go there, but I don't want them to be able to copy or download or upload or copy paste off of that content, right? So I can go in and be able to set policy for those users is very critical. In addition to all the, making sure everyone knows there's an audit trail for compliance and always go back there. But some of those other solutions we talked about, whether you're doing a VPN, just your own browser, or you've built your own, don't give you that ability to control policy at a fine enough level when people are potentially, they need to go to the dark web or they need to go to malicious sites, even on the public web. You just want to make sure they don't, they may need to do that, but they don't get tempted to go too much further. So, there are tools.
I saw that in my last position, right? As a threat analyst, I needed to be looking at malicious files and malware and stuff, and I'm not going to do that on my workstation. But you've got to find a way to get it right, and you have to be careful about getting stuff if you're in that realm where you're downloading malicious files and content to then submit to a malware analysis machine on the that you have access to. So yeah, it's a tough job and tough answer there.
Mm-hmm. I've got another one here around, I asked about how they asked before about how, we were talking about how can you not get access to information. There was a question around what are ways examples of how the adversaries may block you from getting access to their information or data. If you're going to a given site or form, what actions might they take on their side to prevent you from getting to it? I have an example just real quick that I heard from a customer the other day I thought was super interesting. We have to remember that depending on who you're dealing with, they can be very sophisticated technology-wise. They're hiring security people, IT people on their side as well in a lot of these countries and in these operations. The specific scenario was first of all, you couldn't access anything if you weren't from an IP in region. That was given, and they had some lower level analysts that couldn't figure that out, right? They just kept getting blocked, but they had users, and they knew from people in that region that this information was there. They actually did have an isolated, a cold computer with a VPN on it, and when they went to hit that site to then download, as soon as that site and the actors on the other side saw that this was a VPN and they were trying to download, they would cut the connection. So they knew that was going on, as compared to being able to go into a tool such as Silo, and you could do that, right? You could, because you're coming from a browser, you're presenting in the right way, you're able to easily go and download that type of data. So there's different ways they can do that.
And that's a great example of it. I don't have any off the top of my head of how, okay. The only thing I can think of is going on the deep and dark web and being able to, you have to log into some of these sites to gain access to what they're talking about. And it's something we would cover in our next, webinar series about what's hiding in that dark web space.
All right. Well, I know there's plenty of other questions that came in. I apologize. We're being asked to wrap up here and to make sure we keep within our promised times. We'll get back to you with all those. We'll get back to you with responses to all the questions we weren't able to answer. Thank you for being so interactive and taking your time today. Julie, I'm going to hand it back to you and maybe take us through the close.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today. Just a couple of reminders before we close out. A copy of the slides for today's presentation is available in the resources list on the right of the slides, and you can download those for later. We do ask that if you can take just a couple of minutes to fill out that survey, let us know how we did. That's how we really make sure that we're providing you guys with the right content. That would be great. And as you can see on the screen, we have a couple of upcoming webinars I want to bring to your attention. If you enjoyed this session, we will have a follow-up session on trust and safety, going over real-life stories on challenges and successes of doing online investigations. And that'll be Thursday, May 20th, and that's the Trust and Safety Part 2. We also have next week, Intro to the Dark Web, Part 1, What's Hiding in the Dark. And that'll be Matt Ashburn will be presenting that webinar. And then following that will be our follow-up to Naked and Exposed Part 2, A Day in the Life of an Online Investigator. And in the third box underneath the slides, you can go to our landing page that shows all of our upcoming webinars through June. Feel free to register for any or all of those webinars that you'd like to attend. So with that, thank you for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.